The British did not conquer India, they bankrupted it. School textbooks tell you the British Empire civilized India. They built railways, they introduced English, they established courts and governance. The narrative suggests India gained something from 2 centuries of colonial rule. This is the cover story. The reality sits buried in ledgers, shipping manifests, and parliamentary budget reports collecting dust in London archives. Between 1765 and 1947, Britain engineered the largest wealth transfer in human history. The number is 9.2 trillion in today's currency. Not billion, trillion. India entered the colonial period as the world's largest economy, producing nearly a quarter of global output. India exited colonial rule, producing less than 4% of global output, with a life expectancy of 32 years and a literacy rate below 17%. This was not decline. This was extraction. The distinction matters. Decline suggests natural decay or internal failure. Extraction points to external machinery designed to drain resources from one territory and concentrate them in another. Britain did not find a poor India. Britain manufactured a poor India because a poor India served British structural interests. Oil did not make the Gulf states wealthy. Control over oil made them untouchable. The same logic operated in reverse for colonial India. India's wealth did not make India strong. Britain's control over India's wealth made Britain untouchable. The system had choke points: Bengal's treasury, the textile trade routes, the opium monopoly, the currency exchange mechanism, the taxation infrastructure. Every bottleneck funneled wealth in one direction: London. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. This story will change how you understand your world today. The mechanisms Britain used to drain India did not disappear in 1947. They evolved. They now operate through international debt structures, trade agreements, and financial instruments you encounter daily. The IMF structural adjustment programs of the 1990s. The commodity pricing systems enriching multinational corporations. The tax haven networks moving $427 billion out of developing economies every year. These are descendants of the system Britain built in India. You live in a global economy shaped by colonial extraction, the wealth disparities between nations, the debt traps binding developing economies, the pricing structures disadvantaging producers in the global south. All of these trace their origins to the machinery Britain perfected over 182 years of Indian colonial rule. Understanding this history does not offer you a time machine. It offers you a map showing how wealth flows from the many to the few, a map showing the infrastructure of global inequality, a map showing why some nations remain trapped in cycles of poverty, while others accumulate capital without producing proportional value. Let us trace the money. Before 1757, European traders arrived in India as supplicants. India produced the finest textiles on earth. Indian cotton cloth, known as calico and muslin, commanded premium prices across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The quality was so superior that British textile workers rioted against Indian imports in 1699, 1719, and 1721. Parliament passed protectionist laws banning Indian cloth from British markets. India produced 25% of global manufacturing output. Britain produced 1.9%. Indian artisans worked with technologies European craftsmen would not match for another century. A single Dhaka muslin weaver produced cloth so fine that a 6-yard piece weighed less than 100 grams. British observers described it as woven air. The Mughal court consumed luxury goods that made European monarchs appear provincial. European merchants paid for Indian goods in silver and gold. They had nothing else India wanted. Between 1600 and 1757, European powers shipped approximately $100 million in bullion to India. India was a sink for precious metals because India produced what the world demanded. This was the economy Britain seized. The transformation began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Robert Clive bribed Mir Jafar, a commander in the Bengali army, to betray his ruler. Clive won the battle before it started. The military victory gave the East India Company control over Bengal, the richest province in India. Within 1 year, Clive extracted $2.5 million from Bengal's treasury. This single payment exceeded the annual revenue of the British Crown. The company immediately restructured Bengal's economy. Land taxes increased 300% within 2 decades. The company paid Indian weavers with Indian tax revenue, eliminating the need to import silver. This created the foundation of what economists call unrequited exports, or exports for which the seller receives no payment. Consider the mechanism. Britain wanted Indian cloth. Previously, Britain paid for this cloth with silver. After 1757, Britain paid for this cloth with money it had already extracted from Indian taxpayers. India sent goods to Britain. Britain sent nothing in return. The trade ledger appeared balanced because the company recorded Indian tax revenue as payment for Indian goods. This was not trade. This was tribute disguised as commerce. The drain accelerated. Between 1757 and 1780, The East India Company transferred approximately $38 million from Bengal alone. Adjusted for inflation, this equals $4.3 billion in 2023 values. This happened before the company controlled the rest of India. Angus Maddison, the economic historian whose GDP calculations inform modern development economics, documented the transformation. In 1700, India's share of world GDP stood at 24.4%. By 1820, after 60 years of company rule, it had fallen to 16%. By 1913, at the height of the British Raj, it collapsed to 7.5%. By independence, in 1947, India produced 4.2% of global output. The same period saw Britain rise from 2.9% to 6.5% of world GDP. British industrial output increased 1,000%. Correlation is not causation. The next chapters will show you the causation. The British built a sophisticated extraction apparatus. It had three primary components: the home charges system, the council bills mechanism, and manipulated exchange rates. Each component performed a specific function in transferring wealth from India to Britain. Start with the home charges. Britain billed India for the privilege of being colonized. Every year, the colonial administration submitted invoices to the Indian Treasury for expenses incurred in London. These expenses included pensions for retired British officials who had served in India, salaries for the India Office staff in London, interest payments on loans Britain had taken to finance wars fought with Indian soldiers on Indian soil, training costs for British military officers assigned to Indian regiments, purchases of military equipment manufactured in Britain and shipped to India. The Indian budget paid for all of it. Parliamentary records from 1870 to 1920 document these charges in detail. The amounts range from 12 million to 40 million annually. At peak extraction, approximately 26% of Britain's national budget derived from Indian revenues. India paid Britain to administer India. India paid Britain to garrison India with British troops. India paid Britain to train the officers who commanded Indian soldiers. India even paid Britain for the pleasure of having British goods sold in Indian markets. Dadabhai Naoroji, the first Asian elected to British Parliament, documented this system in his 1901 book, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. He called it the drain. His calculation showed India losing $30 to $40 million annually through these invisible extraction mechanisms. His exact words: "The drain of wealth from India to England consists of money drawn from India and spent in England without any return to India whatsoever." The home charges created a structural obligation, but Britain needed a financial instrument to execute the transfer. This brings us to the council bills. Here's how the system worked. British merchants and officials in India wanted to send money to Britain. Moving physical gold and silver across oceans was expensive and risky. So the India office in London sold council bills. A British merchant in Calcutta would pay rupees to the Indian colonial treasury. In exchange, he received a bill redeemable for sterling in London. The Indian treasury now held rupees. The merchant now held a claim on sterling. The India office in London would honor the bill, paying out pounds from the sterling reserves it held. Where did the India office get those sterling reserves? From the home charges? India had already paid Britain in sterling for administrative expenses. Britain used those sterling payments to honor council bills purchased with rupees in India. Trace the flow. Indian taxpayers paid rupees in taxes. The colonial government used those rupees to purchase council bills. The India office in London exchanged those bills for sterling. British merchants, officials, and businesses received sterling in London for rupees they had deposited in India. At every step, wealth moved from India to Britain. No equivalent goods or services moved from Britain to India. Professor Utsa Patnaik of Jawaharlal Nehru University spent 50 years studying this mechanism. Her research examined 200 years of trade data from British India. Her conclusion: Britain extracted approximately $9.2 trillion from India through this system. The third component was exchange rate manipulation. Britain controlled the rupee-sterling exchange rate. Colonial administrators set this rate to benefit British interests. When India exported goods, a weaker rupee meant British buyers paid less. When India imported goods, a stronger rupee meant Indian buyers paid more. Britain adjusted the rate to maximize extraction at each point. The Currency Commission reports of 1893 and 1898 document deliberate manipulation. British officials debated openly how to set exchange rates to benefit British textile manufacturers competing against Indian products. These three mechanisms formed the extraction machinery. Home charges created the obligation. Council bills executed the transfer. Exchange rate manipulation maximized the yield. Britain did not accidentally destroy Indian manufacturing. Britain intentionally destroyed Indian manufacturing because Indian manufacturing competed with British manufacturing. Begin with textiles. In 1700, India dominated global textile production. Indian cloth was superior in quality and cheaper in price than anything Europe produced. British merchants could not compete, so Britain changed the rules. Parliament imposed tariffs of 70 to 80% on Indian textiles entering Britain. Indian cloth became prohibitively expensive in the British market. Simultaneously, British cloth entered India duty-free. Indian manufacturers faced a competitor who had rigged the market. The tariff asymmetry devastated Indian weavers. Ramesh Chunder Dutt, a member of the Indian Civil Service and economic historian, documented the destruction in his 1902 book, The Economic History of India. His data told a clear story. The city of Dhaka had been the center of muslin production. The Governor-General of India, William Bentinck, wrote in 1834, "The bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." This was not metaphor. This was observation. The destruction served British industrial interests. Lancashire textile mills needed markets. India provided a captive market of 300 million consumers. The same India whose weavers had once clothed the world now imported cloth from Britain. The structural transformation shows in workforce data. In 1750, approximately 15% of India's population worked in agriculture. The rest worked in manufacturing, trade, and services. By 1900, approximately 75% of India's population worked in agriculture. India had deindustrialized. The term matters. Deindustrialization is the reversal of economic development. Countries develop by moving workers from agriculture to manufacturing. Manufacturing produces higher value. Manufacturing builds skills. Manufacturing generates surplus for investment. Britain reversed this process in India. Indian workers moved from manufacturing back to agriculture. The economy regressed. The skills disappeared. The capital formation stopped. This was not a natural economic transition. This was engineered regression. Britain needed India as a market for British manufacturers and a source of raw materials for British factories. An industrialized India would compete. A deindustrialized India would consume. The railways provide the clearest example of infrastructure serving extraction. Historians often cite Indian railways as evidence of British developmental investment. The railways connected agricultural regions to ports. The railways transported raw cotton to ships bound for Lancashire. The railways carried British manufactured goods into the Indian interior. The railways served extraction, not development. British investors financed the railways with guaranteed returns paid by the Indian Treasury. If a railway earned less than 5% annual profit, Indian taxpayers covered the difference. British shareholders bore no risk. Indian budgets bore all risk. The railways charged freight rates designed to favor British trade. Raw materials moved cheaply to ports. Manufactured goods moved cheaply into the interior. Goods moving between Indian cities cost more than goods moving to and from Britain. Every component of the railway system came from Britain. The tracks, the engines, the rolling stock, the equipment. Indian industry received no contracts. Indian workers gained no technical skills. Indian manufacturers built nothing. When the railways needed maintenance, Britain supplied the parts. When the railways needed expansion, Britain supplied the capital. When the railways generated profits, Britain received the returns. The railways extracted approximately $18 million per year from India for 50 years. Indian taxpayers financed an infrastructure system designed to drain Indian resources. Between 1765 and 1947, India experienced 12 major famines. These famines killed an estimated 35 million people. The British continued extracting revenue throughout each famine. This was not negligence, this was policy. Examine the Bengal famine of 1770. The East India Company had controlled Bengal for 13 years. The company had tripled land taxes. When drought struck in 1769, farmers had no reserves. They had paid their reserves to company tax collectors. The famine killed approximately 10 million people. 1/3 of Bengal's population died. The company's response? Maintain revenue collection. Records show company officials continued demanding taxes from surviving farmers, even as corpses lined the roads. Revenue collection in 1771 exceeded revenue collection in 1768. Before the famine began. The company profited from the famine. Grain prices rose. The company controlled grain stores. The company sold grain at inflated prices to those who could pay. Those who could not pay died. This pattern repeated across subsequent famines. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878. The Indian Famine of 1896 to 1897. The Indian Famine of 1899 to 1900. Each followed the same structural logic. The 1876 famine coincided with a wheat glut in Britain. Grain prices were falling. British merchants needed markets. India, in the grip of famine, became an export market for British grain while simultaneously exporting Indian grain to other British colonies. Records show India exported 6.4 million hundredweight of wheat during the famine. Grain left starving provinces on railways built for extraction. The exports generated revenue. The revenue flowed to London through the Council Bill system. The Famine Commission of 1901 documented this pattern. The Commission acknowledged that grain exports continued during the 1899 famine, even as 6 million Indians died. The Commission noted that export revenues flowed to London. The Commission recommended no changes to the extraction system. Viceroy Lord Lytton explicitly prohibited private relief efforts during the 1876 famine. He argued that market interference would distort prices. He argued that charity would encourage dependency. He argued that Indians needed to learn self-reliance. 6 million Indians died during his administration. Lytton hosted a celebratory banquet in 1877 with 68,000 guests to honor Queen Victoria's assumption of the title Empress of India. The banquet lasted a week. The famine continued for another year. The economic logic was coherent, if inhuman. Dead farmers reduced future tax revenue, but dead farmers also reduced future food consumption. The calculus weighed extraction against population. The extraction machinery operated without interruption. Mike Davis, the historian who documented these famines in late Victorian holocausts, calculated excess mortality under British rule. His conclusion: British policies killed between 12 and 29 million Indians through famine alone. This does not count deaths from disease, poverty, or displacement. The famines reveal the extraction machinery in its purest form. Human life had a revenue value. When that revenue value fell below the cost of sustaining life, the system let people die. Utsa Patnaik spent 5 decades calculating the drain. Her methodology was precise. She examined trade data from 1765 to 1938. She tracked every category of export and import. She identified exports for which India received no corresponding payment or goods. She calculated the cumulative value of these unrequited exports. She adjusted for inflation. Her conclusion: Britain extracted approximately $9.2 trillion from India in 2023 values. If calculated with 5% compound interest, the figure exceeds $45 trillion. These numbers require context. Britain's current GDP is approximately $2.2 trillion annually. The extraction from India exceeded 4 years of current British economic output. India's current GDP is approximately $2.9 trillion. The extraction exceeded 3 years of current Indian economic output. The transfer financed Britain's transformation. The Industrial Revolution required capital. Britain obtained capital from India: the steam engines, the factories, the railways, the military that conquered a quarter of the globe. Indian wealth funded these achievements. Consider the counterfactual. India entered the colonial period with 24.4% of world GDP. India possessed manufacturing capabilities exceeding European standards. India had accumulated capital over centuries of profitable trade. What would India's development trajectory have been without colonial extraction? Economic modeling suggests India would have industrialized alongside Europe. India had the prerequisites: skilled labor, accumulated capital, market access, and manufacturing tradition. Colonial rule removed the capital. Colonial rule destroyed the manufacturing. Colonial rule captured the markets for British goods. The drain explains the divergence. In 1700, the average Indian and the average Briton had comparable living standards. By 1947, the average Briton earned 15 times the average Indian. This divergence did not reflect natural differences in productivity or ingenuity. This divergence reflected 182 years of systematic extraction. Angus Madison's data tells the story in numbers. India's per capita GDP in 1870, $533, 1990 international dollars. India's per capita GDP in 1913, $673. India's per capita GDP in 1950, $619. India's economy grew slower than its population for the final decades of colonial rule. Indians became poor even as the global economy expanded. Britain's per capita GDP in 1870, $390. Britain's per capita GDP in 1913, $4,121. Britain's per capita GDP in 1950, $6,139. Britain grew steadily richer throughout the period. Part of that growth derived directly from the extraction machinery operating in India. The infrastructure of extraction had costs beyond the monetary. The famines killed 35 million. The partition killed another 2 million. The deindustrialization displaced tens of millions from productive work. The destruction of education and healthcare systems left lasting deficits. When Britain departed in 1947, India had a life expectancy of 32 years. India had a literacy rate of 17%. India had a per capita income below subsistence levels. India had almost no heavy industry. India had a traumatized population divided along religious lines by the same departing colonizers. This was the inheritance of extraction. The extraction machinery did not disappear in 1947. It evolved. The mechanisms Britain perfected in India now operate globally. The names have changed. The institutions have changed. The fundamental dynamics remain. Consider structural adjustment programs. In the 1980s and 1990s, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank imposed conditions on developing nations seeking loans. These conditions required governments to cut social spending, privatize national assets, open markets to foreign goods, and maintain currency stability. The conditions mirrored colonial extraction logic. Forced market opening replicated the tariff asymmetries imposed on India. Developing nations lowered barriers to imports, while developed nations maintained barriers to exports from developing nations. Privatization transferred national assets to foreign investors, echoing the company's seizure of Bengal's tax collection rights. Currency stability requirements forced developing nations to hold dollar reserves rather than invest in domestic development. The reserves sat in Western banks, earning Western bankers' interest. Debt servicing extracted surplus, functioning identically to the home charges system. Between 1980 and 2000, sub-Saharan African nations paid $550 billion in debt service while receiving $540 billion in loans. The net transfer flowed to Western creditors. African nations paid for the privilege of remaining indebted. The pattern continues today. Transfer pricing allows multinational corporations to shift profits from countries where they do business to low-tax jurisdictions. A mining company extracts copper in Zambia. The company sells the copper to its own subsidiary in Switzerland at artificially low prices. The company records profits in Switzerland, not Zambia. Zambia receives minimal tax revenue. Switzerland holds the capital. The United Nations estimates $100 billion leaves Africa annually through these mechanisms. This is the modern version of unrequited exports. Resources leave developing nations. Payment never arrives. Commodity pricing structures disadvantage producers. Coffee farmers in Ethiopia receive less than 10% of the final retail price of coffee sold in London. The remainder flows to processors, traders, and retailers in developed economies. The farmers remain poor. The traders grow wealthy. This is the modern version of the company buying Indian textiles with Indian tax revenue. The producers create value. Others capture the value. Your world reflects these extraction patterns. The clothes you wear cost less because garment workers in Bangladesh earn $95 per month. The smartphone you hold contains cobalt mined by workers in the Congo earning $2 per day. The coffee you drink in the morning generates more profit for a Swiss trading company than for the farmer who grew it. These are not market outcomes. These are designed outcomes. The infrastructure of extraction creates incentives for wealth to flow from producers to gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are banks, trading companies, and corporations headquartered in former colonial powers. In 2015, Indian MP Shashi Tharoor delivered a speech at the Oxford Union. He cited the drain figures. He demanded an acknowledgement of colonial extraction. The speech went viral. It received over 10 million views. The response revealed how deeply the colonial narrative persists. British commentators argued that railways justified extraction. They argued that English justified extraction. They argued that governance structures justified extraction. They did not address the $9.2 trillion. The debate over colonial reparations continues. Some argue the past is past. Some argue modern generations bear no responsibility for ancestral crimes. Some argue that calculating damages is impossible. The documentation says otherwise. The ledgers exist. The parliamentary records exist. The trade data exists. Utsa Patnaik spent 50 years analyzing these records. The calculation is not impossible. The calculation has been completed. What remains is the question of accountability. You now understand how the extraction machinery operated. You understand its scale. You understand its mechanisms. You understand its modern descendants. This knowledge does not change the past. It clarifies the present. When you read about debt crises in developing nations, you recognize the pattern. When you read about commodity price collapses impoverishing farmers, you recognize the pattern. When you read about multinational corporations paying minimal taxes in countries where they operate, you recognize the pattern. The ghost in the machine is the extraction logic. Wealth flows from the many to the few. The infrastructure ensures the flow continues. The narrative obscures the infrastructure. You now see the infrastructure. Britain did not civilize India. Britain did not develop India. Britain operated the largest wealth extraction system in human history for 182 years. The system worked. Britain became a global superpower. India became synonymous with poverty. The ledgers tell the truth. The money trail tells the truth. The GDP figures tell the truth. From 24.4% of world output to 4.2%. From the world's manufacturing center to a deindustrialized agricultural colony. From accumulated wealth to structural poverty. This was not decline. This was extraction. Now you know.